The wind howled through the narrow streets of Port Haven, Oregon, on a bitter November evening in 2008, carrying with it the sharp sting of salt from the Pacific Ocean. Rain lashed against the fogged-up windows of the Anchor Diner, a weathered little establishment perched on the edge of the coastal town, its neon sign flickering defiantly against the storm. Inside, Clara Bennett, a 28-year-old cook with tired hazel eyes and flour-dusted hands, moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter. The diner was nearly empty, save for Old Man Jenkins nursing a coffee in the corner and a trucker hunched over a plate of meatloaf. The rhythmic clatter of pots and the sizzle of the grill filled the air, blending with the soft croon of an old jukebox playing Patsy Cline. Clara wiped her brow, her apron streaked with grease, and glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Another late shift, another night of aching feet, and a meager handful of tips. But it was enough to keep her small studio apartment heated enough to keep her going. She didn't ask for much, never had. Life had taught her to expect little growing up in foster homes, where kindness was as scarce as a sunny day in Port Haven. Outside, the storm raged on the wind, rattling the diner's loose shutters like an angry spirit. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, drawn by a flicker of movement under the dim glow of a street lamp across the road. She squinted through the rain-streaked glass, her heart catching in her throat. There, huddled together in a pitiful cluster, were three small figures, their silhouettes barely distinguishable against the downpour. Children, she realized, her chest tightening. They stood pressed against each other, as if their frail bodies could shield one another from the cold. Clara set down the spatula she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly, and moved closer to the window. The light revealed more tattered jackets too thin for the weather, soaked sneakers with holes and faces pale as moonlight, their eyes bees-wide and wine-hollow. They couldn't have been older than 12, maybe younger, and they looked like they hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Clara's breath fogged the glass as she watched them. The oldest, a girl with tangled dark hair, held the hands of the two younger ones, a boy and a smaller girl whose shivering was visible even from a distance. They weren't begging, weren't knocking on the diner's door. They just stood there, staring at the warm glow of the diner like it was a world they could only dream of entering. Clara's mind raced. Port Haven was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone's business, but she'd never seen these kids before. Where were their parents? Why were they out in this storm? The questions gnawed at her, but something deeper. A quiet, aching memory of her own childhood stirred in her chest. She remembered nights like this, cold and alone, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. Without a second thought, Clara pushed through the swinging door to the dining area, ignoring the curious glance from Jenkins. "Be right back," she muttered, though no one was really listening. She grabbed her coat from the rack, an old wool thing that smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a slap rain, soaking her hair in seconds, but she didn't care. She crossed the street, her boots splashing through puddles, and stopped a few feet from the children. Up close, they looked even more fragile, their clothes clinging to their thin frames, their faces etched with a mix of fear and exhaustion. The oldest girl stepped forward, shielding the others, her jaw set despite the tremble in her lips. "Hey," Clara said softly, crouching to their level, her voice steady, despite the rain dripping down her face.
"You kids okay? It's freezing out here."
The oldest girl didn't answer right away, her eyes narrowing as if weighing Clara's intentions. The boy, his hair plastered to his forehead, clutched the smallest girl's hand tighter. The little one peeked out from behind her wide blue eyes, catching the street lamp's light. "I'm Clara," she continued, keeping her tone gentle. "I work at the diner over there. You look like you could use something warm. Want to come inside?" The oldest girl hesitated, glancing at her siblings. "We don't have money," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the wind, tinged with a defiance that broke Clara's heart. "Don't need charity either." "It's not charity," Clara replied quickly, offering a small smile. "It's just soup. I made too much tonight, and it'll go to waste if someone doesn't eat it. You'd be doing me a favor." It was a lie, but a kind one, and she hoped it was enough. The girl studied her for a long moment, then nodded, her shoulders sagging, as if the weight of the world had shifted just a fraction. "Okay," she whispered, "but just for a bit." Clara led them across the street, holding the diner door open as they shuffled inside, dripping water onto the checkered floor. Jenkins looked up from his coffee, his bushy eyebrows rising, but he said nothing. The trucker didn't even glance their way. Clara guided the kids to a booth in the corner away from prying eyes and grabbed a stack of clean dish towels from the back. "Dry off a bit," she said, handing them out. "I'll get that soup." She disappeared into the kitchen, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was doing, not really, but she couldn't just leave them out there. She ladled steaming vegetable soup into bowls, adding extra chunks of potato and carrots, and grabbed a basket of dinner rolls from the counter. Her boss, Hank, would probably grumble about giving away food, but she'd cover it out of her tips if she had to. When she returned, the kids were sitting close together, the towels draped over their shoulders like makeshift shawls. The oldest girl was whispering something to the boy, who nodded solemnly. Clara set the bowls down along with a pitcher of water and some chipped ceramic mugs. "Eat slow," she said gently. "It's hot." The smallest girl reached for a roll, first her hands trembling as she tore it apart, crumbs scattering across the table. The boy followed, dipping his spoon into the soup with a caution that spoke of too many hungry nights. The oldest girl watched them both before taking a sip herself, her eyes closing briefly as the warmth hit her. "What's your name?" Clara asked, sliding into the booth across from them. She kept her voice light, not wanting to scare them off. The oldest girl swallowed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Lila," she said. "This is Ethan, and that's Sophie." She nodded toward her siblings, who glanced up briefly before returning to their food. "I'm 12. Ethan's 10 and Sophie's 7. Her voice was steady now, but there was a guardedness to it, like she was used to protecting them. Clara nodded, leaning back to give them space. "Nice to meet you all. You live around here." She regretted the question as soon as it left her mouth. Lila's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or shame. "We're fine," Lila said quickly. Too quickly. "Just passing through." Clara didn't push. She'd heard answers like that before, back when she was the one dodging questions from well-meaning adults who never stuck around long enough to really help. The diner grew quieter as the trucker paid his bill and left the bell above the door jingling faintly. Jenkins lingered, his coffee long, cold, his eyes darting toward the booth with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Clara ignored him. She watched the kids eat, their hunger so palpable it made her chest ache. Sophie, the youngest, finished her soup and clutched the empty bowl as if afraid it would vanish. Clara reached across the table, her movements slow, and refilled it without a word. Sophie's eyes lit up, a tiny smile breaking through her shyness. "Where are your folks?" Clara asked after a while, her tone casual, but her heart braced for the answer. Lila's spoon paused mid-air, and Ethan's shoulders stiffened. Sophie looked down at her lap. The silence stretched heavy as the storm outside. Finally Lila spoke, her voice low. "They're gone. Car accident last summer. It's just us now." The words landed like stones, each one sinking into Clara's heart. She swallowed, hard memories of her own losses flashing through her mind, her mother's death when she was 9, the string of foster homes that followed, each one colder than the last. "I'm so sorry," Clara said, and she meant it more than they could know. "Where are you staying?" Lila hesitated again, her fingers tightening around her spoon. "We got a place," she said vaguely. "It's fine." But the way Ethan's eyes darted to the floor told Clara it wasn't fine at all. She thought of the shed down by the docks, a crumbling old thing she'd passed on her walks home, its roof half caved in. Was that where they were sleeping? The thought made her stomach twist. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Listen, I know you don't know me, and I'm not trying to pry. But it's not safe out there, not in this weather. I've got a couch in my apartment just a few blocks away. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can stay tonight, and we'll figure things out in the morning." Lila's eyes narrowed again, searching Clara's face for a catch. Ethan whispered something to her too quiet for Clara to hear, and Sophie tugged at Lila's sleeve, her expression pleading. Finally, Lila nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just tonight." Clara exhaled relief washing over her. She didn't know what she was getting into, didn't know how she'd afford to feed 3 extra mouths on her paycheck. But she knew she couldn't let them go back into the storm. She stood clearing their empty bowls. "Finish up and I'll close out here. We'll head to my place soon." As she walked back to the kitchen, she caught Jenkins staring, his mouth set in a thin line. "You're asking for trouble, Clara," he muttered as she passed. "Those kids ain't your problem." Clara didn't respond. She'd heard words like that her whole life, people telling her to look out for herself, to stop caring so much, but she couldn't. Not when she saw herself in those kids' eyes, in their hunger, in their fear. She finished cleaning the grill, her hands moving on autopilot, her mind racing with questions. What would happen tomorrow? Could she really help them, or was she just delaying the inevitable? She thought of her own childhood, the nights she'd prayed for someone to care, someone to stay. No one ever had. But maybe, just maybe, she could be that person for Lila, Ethan, and Sophie. As she locked up the diner, the storm still raging outside, she glanced at the kids waiting by the door, their towels now folded neatly on the table. Lila was holding Sophie's hand, Ethan standing close, their faces softer now, less guarded. Clara's heart swelled, a quiet resolve settling in her bones. She didn't know how, but she'd find a way to keep them safe. For tonight, that was enough. They stepped out into the rain, Clara holding an old umbrella over the kids as they walked the 3 blocks to her apartment. The building was nothing special, peeling paint. A creaky staircase, the faint smell of mildew in the hall, but it was hers. And it was warm. Inside, she pulled blankets from a closet, setting up a makeshift bed on her sagging couch. Sophie was already half asleep, her head resting on Lila's shoulder. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Clara with a mix of curiosity and caution. Lila stayed by the door, her arms crossed as if ready to bolt at any moment. "You're safe here," Clara said, meeting Lila's eyes. "I promise." Lila didn't reply, but something in her expression softened just a fraction. Clara handed her a spare sweatshirt, one she'd had since high school, and Lila took it, her fingers brushing against Clara's. "Thank you," Lila whispered so quiet, Clara almost missed it. She knotted her throat tight and turned to dim the lights. As the kids settled in, Clara sat in her tiny kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The storm outside had quieted, but inside her a different kind of storm was brewing, a mix of fear, hope, and something she hadn't felt in years, purpose. She thought of her own childhood, the nights she'd spent alone, the foster parents who'd seen her as a burden. She'd survived, but barely carrying scars that still ached on nights like this. Lila, Ethan, and Sophie deserved better. She didn't know how she'd do it, didn't know if she could. But as she listened to Sophie's soft snores and saw Lila's silhouette relax against the couch, Clara made a silent vow. She'd be there for them, no matter what it took. The rain tapped against her window a steady rhythm, and for the first time in a long time, Clara didn't feel alone. The fog rolled in thick over Port Haven, Oregon, as spring of 2009 gave way to a damp, chilly summer, the kind that clung to your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Clara Bennett's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined that stormy night 6 months ago when she'd brought Lila Ethan and Sophie into her world. Her tiny studio apartment, once a quiet refuge for just her, was now a bustling haven for the 3 orphaned siblings. The couch had become a permanent bed draped with mismatched blankets, and her small kitchen table was littered with library books, stray crayons, and half-finished homework. Clara, now 29, moved through her days with a new rhythm, one dictated by school schedules, grocery lists, and the constant hum of worry about making ends meet. The Anchor Diner remained her anchor, its greasy air and clanging dishes a familiar comfort, but her paycheck stretched thinner than ever. Still, every time she saw Sophie's gap-toothed smile or heard Ethan's shy laugh, she knew it was worth it. Clara had managed to rent a 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, a step up from her studio, but still a creaky, drafty place with peeling wallpaper and a temperamental heater. The landlord, a gruff man named Mr. Callahan, had raised an eyebrow when she mentioned the kids, but agreed to the lease after she paid 3 months' rent up front, depleting her savings. She'd moved the siblings in, giving them the larger bedroom, while she took the smaller one barely big enough for a twin bed and a rickety dresser. Lila, now 12, had insisted on helping with the move, carrying boxes heavier than she should have been able to manage. Ethan, 10, followed her lead, his quiet determination masking the grief that still lingered in his eyes. Sophie, just 7, clung to Clara's hand, her wide blue eyes taking in their new home with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "Is this really ours?" she'd asked, her voice small. Clara had knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Sophie's face. "It's ours," she'd said, her heart swelling, despite the weight of the promise. Life settled into a fragile routine. Clara worked double shifts at the diner, her hands raw from scrubbing pans, her feet aching from hours on the concrete floor. She'd leave before dawn, dropping the kids at school on her way, and return late, often past 9 p.m., with a bag of day-old diner rolls or a container of leftover stew. Her tips, once spent on small luxuries like a new sketchbook or a coffee with a friend, now went to school supplies, second-hand clothes, and the occasional treat, a chocolate bar split 3 ways, or a pair of sneakers for Ethan, whose old ones had holes in the soles. She taught Lila to read, sitting at the kitchen table under a flickering bulb, sounding out words from a tattered copy of Charlotte's Web. Ethan struggled with math, so Clara spent her rare free evenings quizzing him on multiplication tables, her patience endless even when her eyelids drooped. Sophie, with her love for music, hummed constantly, her fingers tapping out imaginary melodies on the table. Clara saved for weeks to buy her a second-hand keyboard from a thrift shop, its keys slightly yellowed but still functional. The look on Sophie's face when she played her first shaky tune was worth every skipped meal. But Port Haven wasn't kind to dreamers or do-gooders. The town, with its sagging fishing docks and shuttered storefronts, had a way of grinding hope into dust. Neighbors whispered as Clara walked by with the kids, their voices carrying just enough to sting. "She's throwing her life away," Mrs. Delaney said at the grocery store, loud enough for Clara to hear as she counted pennies for a loaf of bread. "Those kids'll never amount to anything." At the diner, Maureen, a sharp-tongued waitress with a permanent scowl, was worse. "You playing St. Clara," she'd sneer, wiping down the counter with unnecessary force. "What's the point?" They're not even yours. You're just asking for heartbreak." Clara bit her tongue, her hands clenching in her apron pockets. She wanted to snap back to tell Maureen to mind her own business, but she didn't. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with 3 mouths to feed. The criticism wasn't the worst of it. Doubt crept in during the quiet hours when the apartment was dark and the kids were asleep. Clara would sit in her tiny bedroom, the walls closing in, and wonder if she was enough. She wasn't their mother, not really, just a cook with no family of her own, no degree, no savings. What could she give them beyond a roof and a warm meal? She thought of her own dreams, the ones she'd tucked away years ago, art school, a life filled with color and canvas, maybe a little gallery somewhere far from Port Haven's gray skies. Those dreams felt like ghosts, now fading with every bill she paid, every shift she worked. One night, staring at a cracked ceiling, she whispered to herself, "Am I doing this right?" The silence answered heavy and uncertain. But then there were moments that pulled her back. Lila wrote her first poem, a shy, halting thing about the ocean, and slipped it under Clara's door. Ethan, who rarely spoke, started telling her about his science class, his eyes lighting up as he described a project about constellations. Sophie's music filled the apartment, her small fingers coaxing melodies from the old keyboard that made Clara's heart ache with pride. These were the victories, small but bright, that kept her going. She'd look at the kids, their faces softer now, less haunted, and feel a quiet strength settle in her bones. They were hers not by blood, but by choice, and that was enough. The sacrifices grew heavier as the years passed. By 2011, Clara had sold her mother's locket, a silver keepsake, etched with a tiny rose to pay for Sophie's piano lessons at the community center. She'd stood in the pawn shop, her hands shaking as she handed it over, telling herself it was just a thing, not a memory. She never told Sophie, never wanted her to feel the weight of it. She skipped meals to stretch the grocery budget, her own clothes growing threadbare, while the kids got new jackets for winter. She stopped seeing friends, her world shrinking to the diner, the apartment, and the kids. Some nights exhaustion made her brittle, and she'd snap at Lila for leaving dishes in the sink, or at Ethan for forgetting his homework. The guilt would hit her like a wave, and she'd apologize, pulling them into hugs that felt like apologies to herself too. The town's judgment never let up. At a school meeting in 2012, a parent named Karen Phelps cornered Clara, her voice dripping with pity. "You're young, Clara. You could still have a life. Why tie yourself to kids who'll probably end up in trouble?" Clara's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "They're not trouble. They're my family." Karen's smile was thin, disbelieving, and Clara walked away, her hands trembling. She didn't tell the kids about it, didn't want them to feel like burdens. But Lila, sharp as ever, overheard whispers at school and came home quiet, her eyes distant. "Do people hate us?" she asked one night, her voice small. Clara knelt in front of her, cupping her face. "No, Lila. They just don't understand. You're worth every second of this." Lila nodded, but the doubt in her eyes mirrored Clara's own. By 2014, the siblings were growing fast. Lila, now 17, was tall and fierce, her poems filling notebooks Clara bought with her tips. Ethan, 15, had a quiet brilliance, excelling in science and dreaming of college, though Clara worried about the cost. Sophie, 12, was the heart of their little family, her music a constant light. Clara, now 34, felt the years in her bones, her hands rough from work, her dreams a distant memory. But she'd look at the kids, their laughter filling the apartment, and know she'd made the right choice. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Sophie played a new song, a lilting melody she'd written herself. Lila read a poem aloud, her voice steady and proud. Ethan sketched a star chart on a scrap of paper, explaining it to Clara with a grin. In that moment, the weight of her sacrifices felt lighter, the doubts quieter. She wasn't just surviving, she was building something real, something lasting. The kids were her family, her purpose, and no amount of gossip or hardship could take that away. The years had etched their marks on Port Haven, Oregon, by the fall of 2015 as the town's fishing industry dwindled and the gray skies seemed to mirror its fading spirit. Clara Bennett, now 35, felt the weight of time in the lines around her eyes and the ache in her joints from endless shifts at the Anchor Diner. Her two-bedroom apartment, once a symbol of hope for her and the three orphaned siblings Lila, Ethan, and Sophie, now felt like a fragile fortress against a world that seemed determined to pull them apart. The siblings were growing up, their childhood innocence giving way to the complexities of adolescence. Lila, at 19, was a fiery young woman with a poet's heart and a rebel's edge. Ethan, 16, was quiet, but fiercely intelligent. His dreams of studying engineering shadowed by the realities of their poverty. Sophie, 13, carried a quiet strength, her music a lifeline, though her health had begun to falter in ways that kept Clara awake at night. The bonds they'd forged were unbreakable, yet the cracks of doubt and hardship were beginning to show, testing Clara's resolve like never before. The town's economic decline mirrored Clara's own struggles. The diner was quieter now, with fewer fishermen stopping by and tourists bypassing Port Haven for brighter coastal towns. Clara's shifts were cut back, her tips barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and the growing costs of the kids' needs. Lila was in her first year at the local community college, her tuition covered by a small scholarship Clara had fought tooth and nail to secure. Ethan needed new textbooks for his advanced science classes, and Sophie's chronic asthma required inhalers and doctor visits that chipped away at Clara's meager savings. She'd long ago given up on her own dreams of art school, but now even the small comforts, a new pair of shoes, a night off, felt out of reach. She patched their clothes with needle and thread, cooked meals from canned goods, and smiled through her exhaustion, determined to keep the kids from seeing how close they were to the edge. But the kids saw more than she realized. Lila, in particular, was growing restless, her poems darker, filled with images of storms and broken wings. One night in early 2016, she slammed her notebook shut and glared at Clara across the kitchen table. "Why do you keep doing this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You're killing yourself for us, and for what?" "We're just dragging you down." Clara's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "You're not dragging me down, Lila. You're my family." Lila's eyes flashed with anger and guilt. "You're not our mom, Clara. You don't have to do this." The words cut deeper than Clara expected, echoing the whispers of the town Mrs. Delaney's pitying sighs. Maureen's cruel jabs at the diner. She wanted to argue, to pull Lila into a hug, but Lila stormed out, leaving Clara staring at the closed door, her hands trembling. Ethan's struggles were quieter but no less heavy. At school, he faced bullying from kids who mocked his worn clothes and called him the orphan boy. He'd come home with bruises. He tried to hide his silence, louder than any complaint. Clara noticed, though, and her heart broke each time she saw him flinch at a raised voice. She tried to talk to him sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, but he'd shrug and mumble, "I'm fine." One afternoon, she found him in his room staring at a college brochure for an engineering program in Seattle, his face a mix of longing and resignation. "It's too expensive," he said before she could ask. "No point dreaming about it." Clara wanted to promise she'd find a way, but the words caught in her throat. How could she, when they were barely scraping by? Sophie's health was the heaviest burden. Her asthma, manageable in childhood, worsened with the damp Port Haven air. Doctor visits revealed a need for better medication, but the cost was staggering. Clara started skipping her own checkups to afford it, ignoring the persistent cough she told herself was just a cold. One night, Sophie had an attack so severe, Clara had to rush her to the hospital, her hands shaking as she drove through the rain. Sitting in the sterile waiting room, Sophie's small hand in hers, Clara felt the weight of her choices. What if she couldn't keep them safe? What if she failed them? The hospital bill arrived weeks later, a number so large it made her dizzy. She sold her old radio, a gift from a foster parent long ago, to cover part of it, telling the kids it was broken anyway. The town's judgment grew sharper as the years wore on. At a parent-teacher conference in 2017, a teacher named Ms. Grayson pulled Clara aside. "You're doing a lot for those kids," she said, her tone patronizing, "but maybe they'd be better off in foster care. You're not their real family." Clara's face burned, but she held her ground. "They're mine," she said, simply walking away before her anger spilled over. The words followed her home, though gnawing at her. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was selfish for keeping them. Maybe a real family with money and stability could give them more. The thought felt like betrayal, but it lingered heavy as the fog outside. Yet, there were glimmers of light in the darkness. Mr. Hargrove, the town's librarian, became an unexpected ally. A quiet man, with wire-rimmed glasses and a love for books, he noticed Lila's passion for poetry and gave her free access to the library's collection. He'd slip her novels and journals, saying, "For our resident poet." For Ethan, he found science magazines sparking late-night conversations about stars and circuits. Sophie, shy but curious, loved his storytelling sessions, her laughter filling the library's quiet corners. Mr. Hargrove never judged Clara, never questioned her choices. One afternoon, as she picked up the kids, he handed her a cup of tea and said, "You're doing something extraordinary, Clara. Don't let this town tell you otherwise." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. But the shadows of doubt grew darker in 2018. Clara's health took a turn, a persistent fever, a cough that wouldn't quit. The doctor warned of pneumonia, urging rest she couldn't afford. She pushed through, hiding her illness from the kids, but Lila noticed the pallor in her cheeks, the way her hands shook as she poured coffee at the diner. One night, Lila confronted her, her voice breaking. "You're sick, Clara. You can't keep doing this." Clara tried to brush it off, but Lila's eyes filled with tears. "What happens to us if you're gone?" The question hung in the air unanswered. That night, Clara sat alone, her tea cold, and let herself cry. She'd given everything, her dreams, her health, her future. But was it enough? The breaking point came when Lila ran away. It was a rainy evening in late 2018, the kind that reminded Clara of the night they'd met. Lila, now 20, had been distant, her poems filled with anger and longing. After an argument about her skipping classes, she grabbed her backpack and left the door slamming behind her. Clara searched the town, her heart pounding, asking neighbors who only shook their heads. She found Lila 2 days later sitting in the library clutching Clara's old sketchbook, a relic from her art school dreams she'd hidden in a drawer. "I found this," Lila whispered, her voice raw. "You gave up everything for us." Clara knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "I'd do it again," she said. Lila hugged her the first time in years, and Clara felt the weight of her doubts lift, if only for a moment. They rebuilt slowly. Lila returned to college, her poems softer, now filled with hope. Ethan joined a science club, his confidence growing. Sophie's music flourished, her asthma better managed with new medication. Clara scraped together the money for. One night, as winter gave way to spring, they sat on the apartment's tiny balcony, wrapped in blankets, stargazing. Ethan pointed out constellations, Lila read a poem, and Sophie hummed a melody. Clara watched them, her heart full, despite the ache in her chest. The town's whispers, her own doubts, the endless struggle. They faded in the face of this moment. She wasn't their mother, not by blood, but she was theirs, and they were hers. As the stars shone above, Clara made a silent promise to keep going, no matter how heavy the load. The shadows of doubt would always linger, but so would the light of their love, and that was enough to carry her through. The autumn of 2021 draped Port Haven, Oregon, in a golden haze, the Pacific fog mingling with the scent of fallen leaves and salt water. Clara Bennett, now 41, sat on the steps of her weathered trailer, a chipped mug of chamomile tea cradled in her calloused hands. Her life had settled into a quieter rhythm since the turbulent years of raising Lila, Ethan, and Sophie. But the scars of those sacrifices remained lines etched around her hazel eyes, a persistent cough that lingered from her bout with pneumonia, and a heart that carried both pride and weariness. The Anchor Diner still claimed her days, its familiar clatter of plates and hiss of the grill, a constant in her world, though her shifts were fewer now, her body slower. The trailer parked on a scrubby lot near the edge of town was modest, but hers bought after years of scraping by in the old apartment. Inside, photos of the siblings lined the walls, Lila reading her first poem at a college open mic, Ethan grinning with his science fair trophy, Sophie playing her keyboard at a school recital. They were grown now, scattered to their own lives, and Clara, though proud, felt the ache of their absence like a missing limb. She sipped her tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues she hadn't tried to capture on canvas in years, and wondered if she'd given them enough to face the world. The quiet of the evening was broken by the low rumble of an engine, a sound so foreign in her rundown neighborhood that Clara's head snapped up. She squinted down the street, her pulse quickening as a sleek silver van appeared, its polished surface gleaming under the streetlights. Port Haven didn't see cars like this, vehicles that spoke of wealth and faraway places. The van slowed, pulling up in front of her trailer, and Clara's tea trembled in her hands, splashing onto her worn jeans. Questions flooded her mind. Was someone lost? Was there trouble? She set the mug down on the steps, her legs unsteady, as she stood wiping her hands on her sweater. The driver's door opened, and a young man in a crisp jacket stepped out, moving swiftly to open the back doors. Clara's breath caught as three figures emerged, two women and a man, dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a city magazine, their faces scanning her trailer with a mix of anticipation and reverence. For a moment, Clara didn't recognize them, their polished appearances so far removed from the tattered children she'd known. Then all at once, her heart knew what her eyes couldn't believe. It was them, Lila, Ethan, and Sophie. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "No, it can't be." The oldest Lila, now 25, stepped forward, her dark hair sleek and her eyes bright with emotion. Ethan, 22, stood taller than Clara remembered, his quiet intensity softened by a warm smile. Sophie, 20, her face radiant despite the faint wheeze of her breath, clutched a small box in her hands. Before Clara could move, Lila broke into a run, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Clara," she cried, her voice thick with joy. The sound shattered Clara's doubt, and she stumbled forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sophie and Ethan followed their steps quick, and within seconds they enveloped her in a hug so tight it nearly lifted her off the ground. Clara sobbed, her arms wrapping around them, her hands clutching their jackets as if afraid they'd vanish. My kids, she choked out, her voice cracking. Look at you. Oh God, look at you. They pulled back, laughing through their own tears, and Clara took them in, her heart pounding. Lila wore a tailored coat, her poet's fire now tempered with confidence. Ethan's glasses were new, stylish, his posture that of someone who'd found his place. Sophie's dress was simple but elegant, her fingers still calloused from years of playing music. "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice shaky. "You're so grown," Lila laughed, wiping her eyes. "We had to come back, Clara." "For you." Sophie stepped forward, holding out the box, her smile soft but radiant.
"Open it," she said.
Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing a small brass key, its surface catching the fading light. She looked up, confused, her lips struggling to form words. Ethan took her hand, his voice steady. "That's the key to your new home, Clara. Down by the shore. We bought it for you." Clara gasped, her knees buckling, and Lila caught her arm, guiding her to sit on the trailer steps. "A house," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't." "I don't." Sophie knelt in front of her, her eyes shining. "You gave us everything, Clara. You gave up your dreams, your health, everything, so we could have a chance. This is our chance to give back." Clara's tears fell faster, her fingers tracing the key's edges. She remembered the nights she'd gone hungry, the locket she'd sold, the dreams she'd buried. And now here they were, her kids standing before her like a miracle she hadn't dared to imagine. Lila gestured to the van. "That's yours too," she said, a grin breaking through her tears. "No more walking to the diner in the rain." Clara's breath hitched, her mind reeling. She looked at the van, its silver surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight, and shook her head again. How she managed. Ethan smiled, his voice quiet but proud. "I'm an engineer now, Clara. Got a job in Seattle, designing clean energy systems." Lila chimed in, her eyes bright. "I published a poetry collection. It's doing better than I ever dreamed." Sophie squeezed Clara's hand. "And I'm teaching music, Clara. Kids like me who need someone to believe in them." She paused, her voice softening. "Because of you, we made it." Clara covered her mouth, sobs shaking her shoulders. The neighbors, once so quick to judge, peered from behind their curtains, their whispers now tinged with awe. Mrs. Delaney stood on her porch, her usual scowl replaced by wide-eyed silence. Clara barely noticed. Her world was these three, their faces, their love. Sophie opened the box again, revealing a folded piece of paper beneath the key. "There's more," she said. Clara unfolded it, her hands shaking, and read the words. "Clara Bennett Scholarship Fund for Port Haven Orphans. We started it in your name," Ethan explained, "to help kids like us so no one has to feel alone." Clara's vision blurred, the paper trembling in her hands. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. Lila knelt beside her, her voice fierce. "Yes, we did. You gave us hope when we had none. You were our family when the world turned its back." They led her to the van, helping her into the passenger seat, the leather soft and unfamiliar under her fingers. As they drove through Port Haven, the town's familiar streets felt strangely new, bathed in the glow of this moment. They stopped at a seaside cottage, its white walls and blue shutters framed by a garden of wildflowers. Clara stepped out, her legs unsteady, and stared at the house. "Is this real?" she whispered. Sophie nodded, her eyes sparkling. "It's yours, Clara. No more trailers, no more leaks." Inside the house was warm, with hardwood floors and windows that let in the ocean's light. In the living room sat a piano, its polished surface gleaming. Sophie sat down, her fingers brushing the keys, and played a melody she'd written for Clara. a soaring, tender peace that filled the room with love. Clara sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face as Lila and Ethan stood beside her, their hands on her shoulders. "You were the mother we prayed for," Lila said, her voice breaking. "Every night we prayed for you." Ethan nodded, his glasses fogging with tears. "All the good you gave us, Clara, it's come back to you." Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted anything back. I just wanted you to have a chance." Sophie stopped playing, turning to face her. "And because of you, we have more than a chance. We have a future." Clara's sobs turned to laughter, a sound so raw and joyful it startled her. She looked at them, her kids, her family, and felt the weight of her sacrifices transform into something beautiful, something whole. The town, once so quick to dismiss her, began to talk. At the diner, Maureen's scowl softened, replaced by quiet respect. Mr. Hargrove, the librarian, stopped by the cottage with a bouquet of daisies, his eyes crinkling with pride. "You changed this town, Clara," he said. She smiled, shaking her head. "They changed me." That night, as the sun set over the ocean, Clara sat in her new home, a sketchbook in her lap, for the first time in years. She drew the siblings as they were now, their faces full of light, and felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. Her love had rewritten their stories, and theirs had rewritten hers. As the waves crashed outside, Clara closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. She'd given them a home, and they'd given her a family. For the first time in years, she fell asleep, not in worry, but in gratitude, surrounded by love, and finally, home.